Welcome back, everybody. X-Phys guy here again with another cardiac lecture to go over here. This can really be cardiac or really any muscle in general. What we're going to go over is simply just what depolarization means. Depolarization of a cell. We think about this when we think about muscular contraction, whether it's cardiac or whether it's skeletal muscle, and we think about depolarization a lot when we're doing EKGs like we've done in other videos. We hear, well, the cell has depolarized or it's repolarizing. And what does that mean? Well, what it means is if we look at the cell, so this circle up here being the cell, and we have an A, B, C, a D. So this cell, same cell here, an A, normally what happens, especially, and I drew this thinking about a cardiac myocyte, a cardiac cell, so we think about that. The cell is negatively charged inside, so you see these dash lines, and then the plus signs on the outside. So there's an imbalance in the charges, and that's where in the green, it tells us the ion balance inside and outside. I'll get to that in a second. But in A, this is the cell is in the resting state. The resting state. So it's polarized. All right. What happens is we get a signal that's sent from the brain through an action potential, which I'll cover in another video talking about the action potential, the electrical impulse that stimulates up here, the S, action potential stimulation. It's that electrical stimulation that tells our cells it's time to depolarize and contract. So this cell with these little blue dots, just think of this as the wave of depolarization. Now look what's happening. The cell is becoming more positive inside. So compared to the resting state, all negatives. As the cell depolarizes, it becomes more positive, mainly because of two things. Mainly because there's an efflux of potassium, which means the potassium is going out of the cell. And there's an influx of sodium, Na, into the cell. So those are the two big ones that you're having a big transfer of. Sodium in, potassium out. And I'm not going to go over the advanced physiology about how there's always some channels that are open, some leaky channels for the potassium and the sodium. Just remember that in the depolarization, there's a big efflux of potassium out of the cell and an influx of sodium into the cell, which is making the cell more depolarized, more positive. So if we go down to C, now we see that the cell is much more highly positive inside versus the negatives on the outside. So this is a cell that's completely depolarized and is ready to hopefully contract. So you depolarize the cell, you make it more acceptable to accepting that electrical stimuli and then creating the muscular contraction. And you can actually plot the action potential and the depolarization and the EKG waves all at the same time. That's something I'll go over in the next video too. But this is purely just to see how the cell is resting state, negative on the inside. Action potential stimulation travels across that cell and the cell becomes more positive inside due to the potassium K efflux out of the cell and the sodium Na influx into the cell. And the same can be said for the reverse. So in D over here, where the cell is returning to a resting state, this is called repolarization. So in repolarization, we have the potassium coming back into the cell and the sodium leaving the cell. So that's the very basic introduction that I wanted to give to what you see or what you should think about when you hear of depolarization of a cell. What that basically means is we're changing the ionic balance. Now in these numbers down here, you probably won't really ever have to memorize. They might be a little difficult to see, but the internal, so inside the cell at a resting state, sodium 15, potassium 150, and then we have some chloride and some calcium. And calcium becomes much more important for muscular contraction, which I'll do in another video when I talk about the excitation-contraction coupling. But again, you'll probably never have to memorize those numbers, but let's look at the external now. Sodium 145. So internal 15, external 145. Potassium, external 5, internal 150. So what's happening is up in here, we have sodium 15, potassium 150. And then over here, we're looking to get more sodium in, and potassium out. So that is your introduction to cellular depolarization and what that means, especially if you're talking an EKG and we say, oh, the P wave is atrial depolarization. So those cells are being depolarized, which hopefully translates into a muscular contraction.